Hello, welcome to this webinar. On behalf of the European Cooperative Programme for Plant Genetic Resources and our partners in the Horizon 2020 project, Generous Bridge, the European Networks for Forest and Animal Genetic Resources, I would like to welcome you all to this first webinar in the series held in preparation of an upcoming workshop on phytosanitary barriers for genetic resources, which is organized within the framework of Generous Bridge. The Generous Bridge project is harnessing collaboration and knowledge transfer among the plant, forest, and animal genetic resources domains with an aim to strengthen conservation and sustainable use of genetic resources. Ensuring the phytosanitary safety of plant and forest genetic resources during conservation and exchange is of great importance, but also presents a challenge to practitioners as they have to navigate a complex legal environment to enable use of their material in a safe and practical manner. Especially with the backdrop of the International Year of Plant Health in 2020, we are therefore happy to be able to use this forum to provide information on existing regulations and initiatives relevant for the genetic resources stakeholders. This webinar series will provide an overview of EU regulations on plant and animal health and present an initiative by the CGIAR gene banks to facilitate germplasm movements internationally. We're also happy to promote tomorrow's CGIAR webinar on germplasm health in preventing transboundary spread of pests and pathogens, which is organized by the International Potato Center and the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture as part of the CGIAR International Year of Plant Health webinar series. First, a couple of practical things. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on the project website after the workshop. The presentation will be around 20 minutes with time for some questions after. You can write your questions into the chat box or raise your hand if you wish to speak after the talk. Finally, I want to remind you to register also for the other webinars, which take place tomorrow, Friday, and next Monday, and I will post a link to the workshop website with information on registration for the webinars in the chat. For today's webinar, I'm very happy to introduce Yannis Karamitsios, an officer within the plant health section of the European Commission's DG SANTE, the department responsible for EU policy on food safety and health and for monitoring the implementation of related laws. He will provide us with an overview of the EU plant health law, which went into effect in late 2019 and regulates the import into and movement within the EU of plants and plant products, including also germplasm. Welcome, Yannis, and over to you.
Thank you, Sandra, and good morning to everybody. I'm very glad to participate in your meeting. I will make a presentation of 17 slides. I will try to keep it short. It will last less than 15 minutes, and then we can have time for questions and answers. This is the first slide. You can see the title of the presentation. It's about the new EU plant health law. It's the regulation 2016 of 2031. And I represent the responsible unit and department of the European Commission, the plant health unit of DG SANTE. On the right column, you can already see examples of diseases that can affect the plants, fruits, vegetables, and their symptoms. We can move to the next slide. The full title of the regulation is Regulation 2016-2031. It was adopted by the European Parliament and the Council in October 2016 and concerns protective measures against pests of plants. We can move to the next slide. It entered into force on the 13th of December 2016, and it became applicable 3 years later at the end of 2019. We needed that period of 3 years in order to adopt some necessary implementing acts that were essential for its full implementation. We can move on. Everything goes back to Directive 2029. That was then the major plant health law. It worked well for 20 years almost. However, there were some gaps in its concept because it was mainly regulating movement of plants, imports, but it did not have enough provisions to ensure a more proactive approach. Therefore, we moved to the plant health law that I presented before, which is complemented by the Regulation on Official Controls of 2017. And at that time, it was complemented by Financial Regulation of 2014, which is now going to be replaced by a regulation on the multi-annual framework. This financial regulation is necessary in order to finance surveys and eradication efforts, eradications of pests. We can move on. So the objectives of the law is to ensure a better protection of EU plant health, to be more proactive. By more proactive, we mean more surveys, earlier identification and notification of pests, and to be more consistent with the general principle established internationally by the International Plant Protection Convention, meaning to be risk-based, transparent, and along the lines of the international community practices. We can move on. So, as a principle, our import system remains open. There was a big debate whether to close our imports to plants and plant products from third countries in order to protect our territory from pests, and only allow the import of plants and plant products proven to be safe. But at the end, we concluded, and this is what also the Commission supported, to go the other way, to allow everything in, and on the basis of risk, close the trade if something is proven to be risky. Why? Because Europe has a huge trade with the rest of the world. It's the biggest trading partner of the rest of the world in terms of seeds, plants, plant products. It would be really impossible. It will introduce a lot of burden to everybody if we close the imports and open them on a selective basis. Another message is that we apply measures only against specific pests, the most dangerous pests which are regulated permanently or temporarily. Maybe you know better than us that there are millions of pests in Europe. We cannot regulate all of them. If something is everywhere in the continent, we don't take measures anymore. It's a lost battle. Or if something is not likely to establish in the continent, for instance, an Asian or a tropical pest, we don't take measures either. We focus on pests which are not yet here or are here in a limited area of Europe, and we still want to keep them away, although they are likely to enter. And another key message is that we increase the possibilities for ourselves to temporarily ban new trade if we see in a kind of horizon scanning that the risk is increased, the risk for commodities, the risk for the protection of our plants. So this is part of our more proactive approach. We can move on. So the legal framework is the basic regulation of 2016, then some acts that have been adopted since then, and we continue adopting it. Some old emergency measures that we adopted under the previous directive, and some of them remain applicable until today, like the measures against Xylella. It's a very dangerous bacterium that has affected olive trees and many other plants in the south of Europe. And also against pinewood nematode. It's a nematode that has destroyed the pine woods in Portugal, and it's spread also to some areas of Spain. These are two examples of old measures that got updated now or remain in force. And as we said before, it's very important to also apply the rules of the other regulation, the sister or brother regulation 2017-625 on official controls. We can move on. So the basic concept is to define a pest. What is a pest? To define a union quarantine pest. So pest is an organism injurious to plants and plant products. Union quarantine pest, as I said before, is something that is not present in the union territory or present in a limited extent. and its establishment here would have unacceptable economic, social, and environmental impacts. So if such a pest is not yet here, but we fear that if it is established, it will cause a big harm to our production and environment, then we take measures against it. And then we call it Union Quarantine Pest, meaning it is not allowed to be present in the Union territory. If we find it anywhere on the Union territory, we have to eradicate it, to eliminate it. Then we have the Protected Zone Quarantine Pests. These are pests which are present around the Union. We cannot do much, but in certain areas of the Union, for instance, on some islands like Cyprus or Malta, or in areas like in the Baltics or in specific territories, the pest is not there yet. So we want to protect those zones only from that pest not to enter there. So this is why we call it Protected Zone Quarantine Pest. Then we have the priority pests. The priority pests is a subgroup of the Union Quarantine Pests. It's a group of 20 or 21 pests right now, which we have listed under a delegated act, and we consider them as to be the most risky ones. So on those pests in particular, we take more stricter measures with regards to their surveys, eradication, and action plans against their establishment. Examples of priority pests are, as I mentioned before, the Xylella, pinewood nematode, some pests that affect the potatoes, and so on. And finally, we have the regulated non-quarantine pests. Those pests are basically the pests that concern the plant reproductive material. Those pests are everywhere in Europe. We cannot eliminate them. We cannot eradicate them anymore. So we don't take measures against them as quarantine pests. However, we take measures in order to prevent that they are present off plant reproductive material. So we do not tolerate them on a plant which is used to reproduce other plants. So we say zero tolerance, it must not be there, or can be until a particular threshold. So on those pests are specifically listed, and we treat them accordingly. Now, going back to the idea of quarantine pests, just to remind that quarantine pests are pests that are not tolerated at all. If we find them on the territory, we have to eliminate them. So the basic measures to be taken against them is to immediately notify their presence, immediately inform the operators how to handle them if they are found present. Member states have to provide information to the wider public, not only the operators. Specific eradication measures to be taken, for instance, to demarcate an area, fell the infected plants, prohibit the movements out of the infested area, and so on. Surveys is one of the most important tools in order to ensure a proactive approach, and multi-annual survey programs. So member states send us every 5 years their programs that range between 5 and 7 years about the surveys they're about to carry out, and accordingly we co-finance and support them through resources in order to do so, because the survey programs are also expensive. We can move on to the next slide. So further measures to be taken. We can take specific emergency measures for specific pests, for instance, on Xylella or pinewood nematode. A specific measure could be to establish a large buffer zone around the infested area, depending on the possibility of the vector of the pest to fly far or not. We allow member states to take their own temporary national measures, or we take then at union level our union measures against those pests if they are not yet fully assessed. So meaning temporary measures until we determine whether a pest should be quarantined or anything else pest. And then we allow national member states to take their own more stringent measures than the union measures, as long as they do not affect the trade and internal market. For instance, we can say at union level that a buffer zone or a demarcate area would be 5 kilometers long in order to take specific measures and cut trees and fell plants and so on. But a member state can go further, can go beyond the 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers that we might determine at union level. We can move on to the next slide. Yes, we can move on. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yes.
Yes, can we move to the next slide? Hello, I think the slides are stuck. The presentation does not roll on. Yes, now, apart from measures that we take against the pests when they are found in the union territory, we also take measures on imports, on the movement of plants from out of plants that move first of all within the union between the member states. And for those internal movements of the commodities, first of all, we establish the requirement of a plant passport. If a plant for planting, this applies to all plant reproductive material, moves within the union, it requires a plant passport, with the exception of seeds and with the exception of plants which are sold to a final consumer. So if a plant moves from at a business to business level from one operator to another, then we require a plant passport. But when the plant moves to a final consumer, like in a flower shop or in a supermarket, a plant passport is not needed anymore because there would be a quite heavy burden. The plant passport confirms that the plant is healthy. It does not carry quarantine pests. So we keep a list of commodities which are subject to plant passports, meaning basically plants for planting, reproductive material, but also some other plants or fruits in certain cases. When we export, we oblige member states to issue a pre-export certificate if the member state of production is different to the member state of export. For instance, if something is produced in the Netherlands, but then it's exported from Lithuania to Russia. So Netherlands will issue a pre-export certificate explaining that the plant fulfills the requirements of Russia. Then it moves to Lithuania, and then Lithuania issues the phytosanitary certificate to export this plant to Russia in accordance to the latest requirements. And we have more specific rules on the export certificates, and the application of the so-called ISPM 15 mark is a mark that we place on wood packaging material to make sure that the wood is free from pests. We can move to the next slide. We have rules for the registration of professional operators, and also we oblige them to keep for 3 years traceability of the commodities. If they receive something from another operator or they move something to another operator, they have to keep a record of this for 3 years. So in case there is an outbreak, we can trace back the origins of the infected material. We can move on. So the official controls regulation also applies. So there are basic rules for the control of plants that move within the union. For instance, annual frequencies of inspections. We have designated European Union reference laboratories which develop the standards for identifying, for sampling and testing of particular pests. We have specific rules on import controls, the frequency of controls, that everything has to be checked at designated border posts. And all imports are recorded in IMSOC. IMSOC is an electronic database which is handled centrally. All customs are online connected to that system, and we know every time when something enters the Union from any post. This is important to ensure a better control and coordination on our imports to protect our territory from dangerous pests from other continents. We can move on. So that was the very basic principles. In addition to that presentation, your colleague Sandra let me know just before I start the presentation that you're particularly interested in germplasm, in exchange of seeds for the functioning of seed banks. So maybe it would be interesting for you to note that we have specific rules for the movement of material which is intended for scientific purposes or breeding or selection purposes. You can find those rules in Article 8 and in Article 48 of this basic regulation that I mentioned at the beginning. Maybe we can move to the first or the second slide. So it's regulation 2016/2031. Maybe one slide before. Not after, but before, at the beginning. Yes. So in this regulation, you can maybe pay a closer look to Article 8 and Article 48. Under those two articles, we allow specific exceptions for the import of pests, which are otherwise prohibited, or under Article 48 for the import and movement of plants, including seeds, which might be otherwise prohibited, in order to make sure that that kind of material is allowed to move in order to facilitate research, scientific trials, and breeding and selective purposes. On the top of it, you can check a delegated regulation that we adopted in 2019. Please keep note of it. It's regulation 2019/829. I repeat, regulation 2019/829, where we specify further what are the special and I would say lighter requirements that facilitate the movement of such material. So instead of plant passports and phytosanitary certificates for the imports, excuse me, apologies. My apologies, there was an emergency. So please keep in mind that we have this Article 8 and 48 out of this basic regulation and the delegated regulation of 2019/829 that specifies those rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yannis. That was a very interesting introduction to the European plant health regulation. Again, to remind participants that they can now ask questions either by typing them into the question box or even raising the hand We have a question from Vincent Johnson, and he wants to know what is the EU stance on vectors as pests, for example, considering that Xylella is transmitted by leafhoppers. How does the EU consider disease-carrying vectors in the legislation?
Yes, sometimes we also list the vectors as pests themselves. So when we regulate a pest like Xylella, we take measures against the pest, against Xylella, but sometimes we write also rules against the vector of Xylella. So we can say that a tree is destroyed, it's felled, and we have to ensure that also the vectors do not jump out of the tree and fly away. This is just a very small practical example. So we have listed as pests also some vectors, or if we do not list them as pests, we write measures against them.
Okay, thank you. There was a question from Lava Kumar. He is not in the EU, so he wants to know, what are plant passports? Are they the same as phytosanitary certificates, including procedures, or does a different process apply?
Yes. The phytosanitary certificates are official certificates issued by a third country, like Brazil or America, confirming that their products comply with the EU standards and they are necessary in order to import those plants into the EU. The plant passports are for our internal movement. They are not necessarily issued by the competent authority, by an official authority. Of course, they can be issued by an official authority, but lately, and under these new rules, we allow the professional operators themselves to issue them under the official supervision of the competent authority. Those plant passports can be small stickers, small labels. They have to carry on them particular, very specific information. You can find it in Annex 7 of this basic regulation. And we also adopted an implementing act harmonizing the format of those plant passports. Before, under the old legal regime, actually, we had identified 600 different formats all over Europe. Every operator was using his own plant passport with different color, different shape. Now we harmonize them, and now the plant passports are more visible and easier to distinguish.
Thank you. One question from Gordana Duric. What about plant material for gene banks? And I think you started responding to.
Yes, in principle, seeds, if you mean seeds, seeds are less heavily regulated because usually they carry a lower phytosanitary risk. So usually seeds are not subject to plant passports for our internal movement. But some of them, like tomato seeds, for instance, if they are let's say, highly suspicious to host dangerous quarantine pests, then we ask for special rules for their movement, like plant passports or sampling and testing to be carried out. But don't forget that seeds, on the other hand, are usually subject for their movement to the rules on regulated non-quarantine pests. If they are intended to reproduce other seeds, other material, they are subject to higher requirements. If they are intended for gene banks only, for research and preservation, they are not subject to those rules. They are subject to lighter rules. And so those, this kind of material, as I mentioned before, might be subject to the specific regulation 2019/829.
I found this on the web, and I'll post it in the chat actually for everybody. So the Gordana kind of elaborates more on this question. So she's specifically dealing with apple trees. So how do you exchange buds of old apple cultivars? And would it be necessary to have technical dossiers or similar to passports to accompany those?
I don't think so. I'm not sure, because the problem with the small apple trees is that they are still plants for planting. They still carry the risk of spreading quarantine pests around. So they need to be subject to plant passports. They need to be checked that they are free from quarantine pests. So their movement, therefore, because nature doesn't care if it's intended for any use or the other. The quarantine pest is there. We need to be vigilant. However, as I mentioned before, if it is intended for official testing or for particular purposes falling under this regulation that I mentioned before, instead of plant passport, the competent authority might issue a special letter of authority. And this movement, of course, can take place, but under conditions that any potential pest is not spread around.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple more questions, so if people are willing to stay on for a few more minutes. So Lava, as I said, he's not familiar with the EU system, and so he just wanted to know more about the process to for operators to register for issuance of plant passports, and maybe there's a way to find more information on that.
Yes, you can check, I think, Article 65 of this basic regulation, 2016-2031. There it is written that if an operator starts moving, trading plants which are regulated under the plant health regulation, meaning all plants for planting, everything that is meant to be replanted, then that operator will need to register with the national competent authorities, and then will need to get an authorization to issue plant passports.
Thank you. One question from Willem van Dooyevert. He is concerned about the tomato brown rugose fruit virus, which is a quarantine disease in Europe. So is the plant passport also required for small quantities of seeds to be that could have this disease?
Yes, if the seed is regulated, if the seed requires a plant passport, if it's listed in a special annex as such, then yes, the quantities do not matter.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one last question from Annette. So she wants to know how it works for distributing seeds from a web shop to private growers. How do they comply with the
from a web shop to private growers?
Yes.
Well, as I mentioned before, a private grower, if it's considered to be a final user, then a plant passport is not needed. Of course, it's a matter of interpretation who is a final user. A final user is defined as a person who uses a plant outside his main professional activities. And sometimes there is a gray zone. If you buy something to place it on your garden, you're of course not a professional, you're a final user. But if you buy big quantities and you do a kind of trade, then it's a matter of interpretation by the competent authorities whether you are a final user or not. So if you are a final, let's say, amateur user, a plant passport is not needed. The rules do not apply. But if you're a professional operator and you buy them for a further professional activity, the rules do apply. We cannot offer a satisfactory answer about all cases. It's a case-by-case assessment to be made by the competent authorities, and it's up to them in some gray areas.
Okay, thank you. There's one final question came in from Matthew Ordich. He's asking, is research breeding use assumed to be destructive, or is material, for instance, vegetatively propagated plants in gene banks, able to be shared at some point in the future?
I am not sure I can give a precise answer on this. I cannot recall any rules about this case. we have in certain cases, I think in an article of this regulation of 2019/829, the answer is given what would happen to the material afterwards. But I cannot recall now by heart that this material needs to be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if it's checked at a later stage and found to be free from Carantine pests, I don't think it is necessary to destroy it.
Okay, that's a very useful information. Thank you very much. Any more questions, or else I would like to thank you, Yannis, for your very nice presentation and very good information, for the good questions to everybody. And I, again, would like to remind all participants to register also for the other webinars and join these discussions. And also, if you're interested to join the workshop, if you're interested in this topic, please contact us by email.
I would like to thank you very much too. I'm honored for the invitation, and please share my email address with the colleagues if they would like to ask any complementary questions. I can answer them back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Thank you.